So today I get on my soapbox and talk about whatever I want. It's going to be the first of my solo shows, which I'm hoping to do more of coming up. Today's topic is what I have come to call the sexual avoidance cycle. It's something I see a ton in my practice. It's actually really common for couples to avoid sex when they're having difficulties. That's what I'll be describing for you today. I'm also going to be answering the first of my user-submitted questions to the podcast. And if you are interested in asking a question, you can go to bettersexpodcast.com and you will see the little speak pipe widget on every page where you can record a question for me anonymously, and then I can answer it on the show if I feel like it would be helpful to a lot of people. So I invite you to do that, and I hope you enjoy the episode. So today's episode is the first in what I hope will be a whole series of solo shows where I don't actually talk to a guest or interview an expert or even a regular person, but I just get on my soapbox a little bit, give you some of the thoughts I have about sex and how you might make it better with your partner. So today's topic is sort of the baseline for me. I'm going to be talking about what I call the sexual avoidance cycle. And this really is the entire premise of my new book, Sex Without Stress. It's really about what is this cycle? What are all the things that play into it, right? How do people get trapped in this thing? Why does it make sense that you're stuck here? And then more importantly, how do you get out? I mean, that's what I really wanted to do with the book, is sort of give you a do-it-yourself, get out of jail free, get out of the sexual avoidance cycle with as little trouble as possible. But today I'm just going to be describing the cycle, because I think it's so fundamental to understand this. And what I find when I talk about it is that people really identify with this. And the fact that it has a name, that I can describe it, lets them know they're not the only people stuck. And I have to imagine that at least some of you listening are caught in this thing and really may feel, I don't know, alone, isolated, broken potentially. But I want you to know this is a very common occurrence. I see this all the time in my practice. And I think it's helpful to realize that this is normal to have trouble with sex. It really is. If you think about the kinds of obstacles that we face in life, it's almost inevitable that we're going to struggle with sex at some point over the course of a long relationship, because things happen. It's normal to have issues come up. Think about sexual dysfunction, illness, disease, changes in our physical functioning can happen, right? Then you throw in the challenges of relationship dynamics, right? I mean, just think about how well you and your partner communicate or not, how you handle conflict, how you grow and change as your life changes together. I mean, of course, that throws a wrench in things. Then we've got desire issues, where our sexual desire can go up and down in a lifetime, and we have to be able to adapt to that. Then we've got busyness, right? You got kids, you got jobs, life gets kind of crazy. It's like, where does sex fit into all of this? Of course, that makes it more difficult. And at the very least, we have aging. We all get older. That makes a difference in our sexual responsiveness and interest as well. So between all of these things, of course, sex gets hard, right? And so we can get really stuck here. So the sexual avoidance cycle is a circle that goes between disappointment, avoidance, and pressure, which leads to disappointment, avoidance, and pressure. That's why it's a cycle. It goes round and round. So the whole thing starts with disappointment, with negative experience with sex. Sex does not live up to our expectations or our hopes and dreams. And again, there are so many reasons this could happen. Once sex starts to be negative. I mean, it's one thing if you have, a bad encounter here or there, you've got, an issue of ED, or didn't get an orgasm once, or, oh gosh, that time wasn't great because we were exhausted. It's not like we can't tolerate or live through a bad sexual experience or a disappointing one. We can. But when it starts to feel disappointing on a regular basis, sex can actually start to feel, I would even say risky, right? Like, it can lead to more bad feelings. We start to worry that it's going to be bad. We start to wonder how our partner's going to feel afterward. Is this going to be a disaster between the two of us? Is one of us going to end up in tears? Am I going to feel inadequate or broken? It starts to feel like a test almost. We show up to have sex and we don't know how it's going to go. It's really risky. I mean, often people tell me it's like a test they expect to fail. Like they really don't think it's going to go well. And maybe every once in a while it does. And it's like, oh, thank goodness that one went okay. But it doesn't really take the stress out of the next time. So sex can start to feel stressful, anxiety-provoking, negative. I mean, one of the words I hear a lot in my practice is fraught, just loaded with tension and danger almost. And, you think about when you were first sexual, or maybe even before that, it was probably hard to imagine that sex would ever be anything but fun, and exciting and easy. It's like that's the idea we have. So when we get to a place where it's constantly, or at least predominantly, feeling dangerous and negative and disappointing, I mean, what a bummer, right? We're not living up to what our idea is about what sex was supposed to be. You add into that the fact that we all have a lot of expectations about sex. We have ideas about how sex is supposed to go, how we're supposed to look, what's supposed to happen, how we're supposed to feel at the end of it. And so again, every time we have sex that doesn't live up to that, it feels disappointing. We feel like something's wrong. And when this starts to happen a lot, when this is happening more and more, it perpetuates itself, right? The anxiety goes up, the stress, the pressure goes up, the apprehension goes up. So what does this lead to? It leads to avoidance. It's human nature to avoid things that are negative and hard. When something causes us anxiety, we tend to avoid it, right? That's normal. Think about how avoidance might be playing out in your sex life. And if you're not doing this now, maybe you've been in a relationship before where this has happened, so you can think back. But people get really good at avoiding sex, and it's an active process. This isn't sort of benign or passive. I mean, it takes some awareness to avoid something, right? So think about whether you and or your partner are avoiding any conversation about sex and any opportunity to have it. Think about this. Are you deflecting bids for sex? Are you pretending you're oblivious and you don't know what they mean? Are you using humor to divert from either a conversation about sex or an actual initiation? Maybe you pick a fight instead, right? Or you start to argue about sex or about initiation so that sort of stops it from going any further. This stuff gets kind of complicated and subtle. Like, think about what you're doing that keeps you from talking about sex or having sex. Think about whether you're actually trying to avoid it at this point, or if you're totally open. And sometimes it's just one of you that's avoiding sex and the other person is still interested in trying. And sometimes both of you at this point are avoiding it. Either way, it's natural to avoid it, but it doesn't help. Because here's where avoidance leads, right? It leads straight to pressure. At first, if you start to avoid sex, time can go by. You can feel like, oh, this is sort of not on anybody's mind, no big deal. But it grows over time. It gets bigger. I mean, at least if one of you sort of wants to have sex, or you think you should be having sex. If both of you are sort of happily not having sex, you don't feel like you need it, that's something different. That's not avoidance. But if you're avoiding it, it takes on a life of its own. This is where it kind of becomes, what people will refer to as the elephant in the room. This is where it gets bigger. This is where you start worrying about it and thinking about it. This is where you start thinking, wait, but we should be having sex. What's wrong with us? Is something broken? Am I with the wrong person? There might be more pressure because you're aware that your partner wants sex, but you don't. Even if they're not saying anything, that awareness is starting to sort of bear down on you. You can feel pressure because you have this idea, like societal idea, that we should be having sex, but we're not, right? It starts to take more and more of your bandwidth. Like it's definitely on your mind, even if you're not talking about it. And maybe you guys just sort of get into a conversation or a fight every once in a while, like it rears its head every once in a while and then it sort of seems to go away again, but it doesn't really go away, right? It's totally present there in your mind and probably your partner's. Another aspect to this pressure is that it increases the pressure on any sexual encounters you do have. So you're largely, you're avoiding a lot of them. But when you do have sex, then because it's less frequent, there's more pressure on that encounter to go well. Right? It's way more loaded because there's sort of something to prove. If you have sex a lot and you have one bummer time, not too big a deal. If you're only having sex every once in a while, really infrequently, it seems like way bigger for it to go badly. So there's more and more pressure on that experience to go well and sort of prove something. But of course, that kind of pressure makes it that much more difficult to have, what you'd think of as a successful encounter, right? It's so loaded. Like, how can anybody have a good time? How can you be relaxed? How can you really just have pleasure, right? It makes it less likely that you're going to have what you think of as a successful encounter. So we're back to disappointment. So I think you can see how these things loop, right? Disappointment, negative sexual experiences feed avoidance, which increases the pressure, which makes it that much harder to have success or fun, which leads to more disappointment. So this just goes round and round and round, and this is where people get stuck. So let me give you a couple of examples here to illustrate this. So I'm thinking about, let's start with people that have some sort of sexual dysfunction. All right, for whatever reason, whether there's been some sort of illness or surgery, or maybe it's age-related, or maybe it's even just performance anxiety with young people. It doesn't really matter. But somehow, at least one of the people is experiencing some problem with their sexual functioning, right? So either not getting to an orgasm or struggling to get aroused, maintain an erection, something like that. So once or twice doesn't necessarily create this kind of situation. But if you start to worry about it, it happens more. And if it's happening more frequently, then sex starts to be an experience where every time you go into it, you have this risk that you're, air quotes here, failing. Okay. Now, I don't like to use success and fail around sex. That's a whole other topic, but it can feel like that. Then if it doesn't get handled well, right? If the other person's upset or somehow it feels disappointing, or gosh, if it comes screeching to a halt, like the sexual encounter, like we have to stop because somebody doesn't have an erection or something like that, it totally feels like a failure, right? It feels like we tried and failed, or it feels negative, or it feels disappointing. This is the kind of thing that people start to feel bad about, and they start to anticipate the possibility of failure, which then leads them to avoid sex. Okay, so now we're back to the avoidance cycle where it's getting bigger and bigger in their minds. They're aware that there's this problem. It's increasing the pressure. And of course, if they do go to have sex, think about the amount of pressure on those people, again, around their physical performance, about whether they can have, again, successful, air quote, sexual encounter. Of course, it's going to be more difficult at that point, right? Which perpetuates this sense of disappointment. So that's one pretty clear example of how a couple, might get stuck in the avoidance cycle. Let's look at one that's based on desire issues, right? So let's say one of the people is struggling to feel sexual desire. They tend to be distracted and kind of overwhelmed with work or with chores or that kind of thing. And it's hard for them to get in the mood. And they might feel rushed in sex, or they don't even know sort of how to get in the headspace of being open. And so they feel a certain amount of pressure and struggle to be interested in sex. So then when they have sex, they're taking their pleasure off the table. They're not speaking up about how much time they need or what kind of stimulation they need to get in the mood. They're starting to have sex on a regular basis where, well, I'm showing up to do this for my partner, but I'm not really that into it. Now, that doesn't generally feel good really to either person. So both people are aware that one person's not having that much fun, right? So that's starting to perpetuate a dynamic that feels kind of bad and a bummer, and it's less and less engaging for both people. So that's another thing that people can start to avoid. The person that's more interested in sex might start avoiding initiating because they know their partner's not that into it. And the one that's struggling to feel sexual desire is probably not bringing it up at all. So we start to get into avoidance again, which then increases a sense of pressure because one person kind of wants sex at this point and one doesn't. That starts to grow bigger and bigger. And then when they have sex, all the more pressure on that encounter to prove something different. And it doesn't go that way. So hopefully that gives you a couple of examples or almost visual ideas of how this can play out. And I invite you to think about how this is showing up in your own relationship. Is there any aspect of avoidance, of this avoidance cycle in your sex life together? Now, this whole thing hinges on disappointment, which is based on expectations, avoidance, which is an active choice, and then pressure, which is sort of buying into our expectations. So the way out of this, just briefly, I mean, I'll tackle this again in a later episode, but we have to adjust our expectations so that basically sex can't be disappointing. Like there is no way to fail. I totally believe that. There is a way for any couple to have sex that feels successful. So once we get rid of the expectations, there's no disappointment. Then communication and dealing with something directly is the answer to avoidance. Okay? So you have to make a choice not to avoid the topic and not to avoid the encounters. And then the pressure is solved. It's kind of related to not having expectations. It's about having new kinds of experiences together where you can't fail, where anything can happen, everything is a gift. You get to enjoy whatever you do share, and nothing specific has to happen. So we take the pressure off, which then means you can't be disappointed, right? So we sort of get the cycle going in reverse. There really is a way to do that. So I'll be talking about some of this in future episodes. Just keep your eyes out for these solo episodes that will be listed differently in my podcast list. Keep in touch about that. If you're interested in the book, it's called Sex Without Stress, A Couple's Guide to Overcoming Disappointment, Avoidance, and Pressure. It's available on Amazon now, and it's, like I said, a total do-it-yourself program to try to get yourself out of the weeds here. I hope you'll join me again next week, and I look forward to hearing from you if you have any feedback.
After 1 year of being together, my girlfriend told me that the sex never was good. She keeps making me cry and feel bad and asked if it would be okay if she gets a fuck buddy. I said no and was very hurt. We don't feel attracted to each other anymore either. So what do you think is the appropriate thing to do here?
Thanks so much for that question. Without knowing more about your individual situation, I can't tell you, what to do or what I think would be best to do. But there are things that I can address based on what you said. So the first thing that comes to my attention is that it's a year of you guys being together before she's speaking up, apparently, about not being satisfied in sex. And I would say that's a big problem. I always encourage people to talk early and often about what's working, what isn't working, what you might want different. Two people, at that point, co-create something where it hasn't worked for a whole year. And that's unfortunate. That's a lot of lost ground. And sometimes that's making a lot of negative feelings and resentment and unhappiness sort of fester that didn't need to be that way. So the fact that she's coming to you 1 year later is a problem. On the other hand, that's what you're facing right now, right? Is, okay, here's the situation. She came 1 year into the relationship and is telling me she's not happy with sex. My first thought at that point is to work together to see what you can do about that. Exactly what are her concerns. Some of those might be based in unrealistic expectations. She may have some erroneous ideas about how sex is supposed to go. So those might need to get addressed. But where her concerns stand up, where she really could be getting something better, the two of you could have a chance to change it, to work together, to talk about what it is she wants, how she wants sex to go, and of course, how you want sex to go too, right? It's not just on one person's terms. So my hope would be that even after a year of, less than thrilling sex, that there would still be room for the two of you to work on a sex life that would work for both of you. Now, you also mentioned that you don't think the two of you are attracted to each other anymore. And I wonder about that, because if you were attracted in the beginning, what would have changed? It could just be that the difficulties in your relationship are making it harder to be interested in each other. And that, it could be for good reasons. It's possible that maybe the two of you aren't suited to each other. and it's not worth fighting for the relationship. But if you think you have something really, really solid, then I would encourage you to talk about your concerns in the relationship in general, not just in your sex life. What's going on between the two of you that maybe make you less interested or less positive about each other? So the other part of your question was her suggestion, or her request that she get a fuck buddy, right? And I hear this with clients. Sometimes people propose opening the relationship as a solution to their sexual problems. And I don't recommend that. I mean, at least not until you've exhausted the possibilities of your own sex life, because going in and having sex with somebody else isn't going to help the two of you have a better sex life together. And if your relationship isn't strong enough to be dealing with this together, then opening it up to other people probably undermines the strength of your own relationship too. So while no judgment about whether somebody has an open relationship or not, that's not really the issue. It's what's the cause of doing it. If it's to solve a problem, that usually doesn't work. I hope this was helpful, and good luck to you.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question-and-answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.